Story 1. The Fartom Convoy. Marcus Webb had been hauling freight across the northern routes for 23 years, and he thought he'd seen everything the road had to offer. The veteran trucker from Duluth had driven through blizzards that turned highways into white tunnels of death, navigated fog banks so thick his headlights couldn't penetrate 5 feet ahead, and once watched a tornado touch down less than half a mile from his rig on Interstate 90. But nothing in his 2 decades of experience prepared him for what happened on Route 41 in Wisconsin during the early morning hours of September 14, 2022. The load was routine, a shipment of industrial machinery parts from Milwaukee to Green Bay, the kind of run Marcus could drive in his sleep. He left the distribution center at 11 p.m., preferring the quiet roads and lighter traffic of the night shift. His Kenworth W900 hummed steadily beneath him, the diesel engine's familiar rumble a constant companion as he guided the 18-wheeler north through the darkness. The CB radio played softly in the background, occasional chatter from other night haulers breaking the silence. His GPS showed clear roads ahead, and the weather forecast promised calm conditions until morning. Around 1:30 a.m., somewhere between Fond du Lac and Oshkosh, Marcus noticed another truck appear in his mirrors. The vehicle materialized from the darkness behind him, running lights cutting through the night like amber stars. It was an older model Peterbilt, maybe from the 1980s, its chrome gleaming even in the dim light. Marcus thought nothing of it initially. Plenty of owner-operators maintained vintage rigs, treating them like beloved classics. The truck maintained a steady distance behind him, neither gaining nor falling back, matching his speed exactly. 10 minutes later, another truck appeared beside the first one, then another and another. Within 20 minutes, Marcus counted 15 trucks following him in perfect formation, their headlights creating a river of light in his side mirrors. They drove with unsettling precision, maintaining exact spacing between vehicles, never wavering from their positions. The convoy stretched back as far as Marcus could see, a ghostly procession moving through the Wisconsin night. He grabbed his CB radio, kinged the mic. "This is northbound Marcus on Route 41. Anybody want to tell me what this convoy's about?" Static answered him. He tried again, switching through channels, but received only white noise in response. His cell phone showed full bars, but when he tried calling his dispatcher, the call wouldn't connect. The screen simply displayed calling indefinitely, before timing out with a generic error message. Marcus's hands tightened on the steering wheel. Something was wrong. The trucks behind him maintained their formation with mechanical precision, and as he studied them more carefully in his mirrors, he realized he couldn't see any drivers in the cabs. The windshields reflected his taillights, creating bright spots that should have illuminated the faces of the men and women behind the wheels, but each cab appeared empty, as if the trucks were driving themselves. He pressed harder on the accelerator, pushing his rig up to 75 miles per hour, then 80. The convoy matched him perfectly, maintaining their exact distances. When he tried slowing down, dropping to 50, then 40 miles per hour, they mirrored his deceleration with eerie synchronicity. The convoy wouldn't let him break away. The GPS began acting strangely. The screen flickered, and the familiar map interface distorted, showing roads that shouldn't exist. His route appeared to branch off into impossible directions, highways that curved back on themselves or led to blank spaces labeled only with strings of random characters. The estimated arrival time shifted wildly, jumping from 2 hours to 14 hours to -6 hours in the span of seconds. Marcus decided to exit the highway at the next ramp. According to his memory, there should be a truck stop about 5 miles ahead where he could pull off and figure out what was happening. But when he reached the location where the exit should have been, there was nothing but unbroken highway. He checked his odometer, confirming he'd traveled the right distance, but the exit had simply vanished. His GPS now showed no upcoming exits for 60 miles. The trucks behind him began closing the distance. The perfect spacing of the convoy compressed, each vehicle moving slightly closer, tightening the formation. Marcus felt sweat bead on his forehead despite the air conditioning blasting cold air through the cab. He keyed the CB again, shouting this time, "Somebody answer me! What do you want?" A voice crackled through the speaker, distant and distorted, as if traveling through decades of interference. Keep pace, stay in formation. You're one of us now. One of you? What are you talking about? I don't know you people. You will. You'll understand soon. We all understood eventually. Marcus noticed something impossible. The lead truck in the convoy, a faded red Freightliner with rust patterns along its trailer, bore a company name he recognized. Westfield Freight. The company had gone bankrupt in 2006. Its entire fleet sold off at auction. He'd hauled loads for Westfield early in his career, back when he was a rookie driver learning the routes. But that truck looked exactly as he remembered it, down to the distinctive dent in the passenger side door. More impossible details emerged as he studied the convoy. Each truck represented a different era, different companies, different time periods. Some bore the logos of freight companies that had disappeared decades ago. Others displayed phone numbers with old area codes that hadn't been used since the 1960s. One truck near the back of the formation looked even older. A vintage Mack from what might have been the 1940s, its rounded hood and split windshield unmistakable even in the darkness. The highway itself began changing. The modern asphalt surface rippled and shifted, patches of old concrete showing through, then sections of gravel, then briefly what looked like packed dirt before reverting to asphalt again. Road signs appeared and disappeared, their messages contradictory. One moment a sign would indicate Green Bay was 30 miles ahead, the next moment it would claim 50 miles, then 15. The dates on construction notices spanned decades, warning of roadwork from years that hadn't arrived yet or had passed long ago. Marcus tried the CB again. This time multiple voices responded, overlapping and echoing. Been driving this route since 1963. I left Chicago in '89. Should have been home by morning. There is no home anymore. There's only the road. We keep driving. That's all we can do. When did you join us, brother? What year did you enter the convoy? Marcus's voice shook as he answered. I'm not part of any convoy. This is 2022. I'm hauling a regular load to Green Bay. There's been some kind of mistake. Laughter echoed through the CB, hollow and mirthless. That's what we all said. Check your odometer, friend. Check how many miles you've driven tonight. He looked down at the instrument panel. The odometer should have shown perhaps 50 miles traveled since leaving Milwaukee. Instead, the numbers spun wildly, cycling through thousands of miles, then tens of thousands, the digits blurring as they raced upward. The fuel gauge remained at 3/4 full despite the impossible distance. The clock on the dashboard had stopped at 1:47 a.m. The convoy tightened further. Now only a few feet separated each truck, the formation moving as a single organism through the shifting landscape. Marcus recognized more trucks now. The blue and white Kenworth that used to park at the Flying J in Tama, the distinctive yellow Volvo that belonged to an owner-operator he'd met at a way station years ago, a man who died in a jackknife accident on black ice, the International with a custom paint job that had disappeared with its driver somewhere in Minnesota, the unsolved case making regional news for weeks. Where are the lost ones? A woman's voice said through the CB, tired and resigned. The ones who left for a run and never arrived. The ones whose trucks were found empty on the roadside, or never found at all. The ones who vanished into the night and became stories other truckers tell at rest stops. That's not happening to me, Marcus said, but his conviction wavered. The world outside his windows had become unrecognizable. The landscape flickered between different seasons, snow appearing and melting in seconds, trees cycling from bare branches to full foliage and back again. Buildings appeared by the roadside, ancient rest stops and gas stations from decades past, their signs advertising prices from different eras. He tried every exit that appeared, but his steering wheel wouldn't respond when he attempted to turn. The truck kept moving forward, locked into the convoy's trajectory. The brakes did nothing when he pressed them. The transmission refused to shift out of gear. His rig had become a prison, moving at 70 miles per hour through a nightmare landscape that defied physics and time. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Marcus had no way to tell anymore. The clock remained frozen. His phone's battery indicator stayed at 42%, no matter how long he stared at it. The landscape outside cycled through the same sections of highway repeatedly, an endless loop of familiar yet wrong scenery. "How long?" he finally asked through the CB. "How long have you been driving?" "Time doesn't work the same here," a man's voice answered. "Could be days, could be decades. We lost count. The road just goes on forever." Marcus felt tears sting his eyes. He thought of his wife waiting at home, his daughter who just started college, his son who worked as a mechanic and maintained Marcus's truck during off hours. They'd wait for him to arrive in Green Bay. When he didn't show up, they'd call his dispatcher. Eventually, someone would find his truck, or maybe they wouldn't. Maybe he'd just become another story, another unsolved disappearance, another trucker who left for a routine run and vanished into the American night. The convoy continued north, or east, or perhaps in no direction that existed on normal maps. The phantom trucks rolled endlessly through their impossible journey, a collection of the lost and forgotten bound together in eternal transit. Marcus's hands gripped the steering wheel, though it no longer responded to his input. He watched the road unfold ahead, the same road he'd driven hundreds of times before, now transformed into something unknowable and inescapable. "Welcome to the convoy," the CB crackled. "We've been waiting for you, Marcus Webb. Every convoy needs new drivers. The road is always hungry for more." His truck rolled on through the darkness, one more set of headlights in the phantom procession. One more lost soul added to the collection of drivers who'd left for routine runs and never came home. Behind him, he could feel the presence of the countless others, all trapped in the same eternal journey, all bound to the road forever. And ahead, the highway stretched on into infinity, unchanging and inescapable, a prison without walls that would never let them go. Story 2. The Backwards Mile. Daniel Torres had driven every major highway in the southwest United States during his 16 years as a long-haul trucker, but Interstate 40 through New Mexico remained his favorite. The stark beauty of the desert landscape, the way the light changed as the sun moved across endless sky, the sense of space and freedom that came from driving through such vast emptiness. On the night of March 28, 2023, that familiar highway betrayed him in ways he still struggles to explain. The run was simple enough. Daniel was hauling electronics from Albuquerque to Amarillo, a straight shot east across the state line into Texas. He made the same trip probably 200 times in his career, knew every truck stop and rest area, every slight elevation change and curve in the road. His Freightliner Cascadia was loaded properly, weight distribution perfect, papers all in order. The weather was clear, temperature mild for late March in New Mexico. Everything was routine. He left the Albuquerque distribution center at 9 p.m., planning to reach Amarillo around 3 in the morning. The first hour passed normally. Daniel kept his rig at a steady 70 miles per hour, listening to a true crime podcast through his phone speakers, occasionally checking his mirrors and scanning the road ahead. Traffic was light, mostly other commercial trucks making nighttime runs. His GPS showed him making good time, the little blue dot representing his position moving steadily across the digital map. Just past the exit for Klein's Corners, approximately 60 miles east of Albuquerque, Daniel experienced his first indication that something was wrong. A road sign appeared in his headlights, a standard green highway sign marking the distance to the next major city. Albuquerque, 60 miles, it read. Daniel blinked, certain he'd misread it in the dark. But as his truck passed beneath the sign, he confirmed what he'd seen. According to the sign, he was 60 miles from Albuquerque. He checked his GPS. The device showed him right where he should be, approximately 60 miles east of Albuquerque, heading toward the Texas border. The odometer confirmed he'd traveled the right distance. But the sign had indicated Albuquerque was ahead of him, not behind. Daniel shook his head, attributing the discrepancy to a vandalized or incorrect sign. The highway department made mistakes sometimes. 5 minutes later, another sign appeared. Albuquerque, 55 miles. Daniel's hands tightened on the wheel. That wasn't possible. He'd been driving east continuously, maintaining 70 miles per hour. Albuquerque should be getting farther away, not closer. He checked his GPS again. The device still showed him moving east, still indicated he was on course and making proper progress toward Amarillo. Daniel grabbed his CB radio. "Any westbound drivers on 40 near Klein's Corners, you reading me?" A moment later, a voice responded. "This is westbound Charlie. I'm about 20 miles west of Klein's Corners. What do you need, driver? You see any eastbound Freightliner with a silver trailer?" "Negative. Haven't passed any eastbound traffic for the last 10 minutes or so." Daniel looked down at his dashboard, confirming his headlights were on. His running lights illuminated. He was visible. Any westbound driver should have seen him. "Copy that. Thanks anyway." He replaced the CB handset, a chill running down his spine despite the warm air blowing from the heater vents. The landscape outside looked wrong. Daniel had driven this stretch of Interstate 40 so many times he could navigate it from memory. He knew the shapes of the mesas visible against the night sky, knew where certain distinctive rock formations should appear, but the terrain outside his windows didn't match his memories. The mesas seemed to be in different positions, their silhouettes unfamiliar. A radio tower that should have been visible on his right side appeared instead on his left. Another sign emerged from the darkness. Albuquerque, 45 miles. Daniel felt his heart rate accelerate. This was impossible. He'd been driving continuously for over an hour, maintaining speed, never deviating from the highway. Yet, according to the signs, he was getting closer to his starting point, as if the highway were somehow flowing backward beneath his wheels. He tried his cell phone, calling his dispatcher. The call connected and Jerry's familiar voice answered. "Torres, what's up? You making good time?" "Jerry, I need you to check something. Pull up the GPS tracking on my truck." "Where does it show me?" "Hold on." Daniel heard keyboard clicks. "Shows you on 40, about 70 miles east of Albuquerque. Right on schedule." "Why?" "The road signs are saying something different. They're counting down miles to Albuquerque like I'm heading west." A pause. "Your GPS has you heading east, Daniel. Are you feeling okay? Maybe pull over and take a break, get some coffee." "I'm fine. The GPS is showing east, but something's wrong with." The call dropped. Daniel looked at his phone. No signal. The indicator bars had disappeared completely. He tried calling back, but the phone couldn't find service. The next sign read, "Albuquerque, 35 miles." Daniel checked his odometer again. He'd now driven nearly 90 miles since leaving Albuquerque. Even if he'd somehow gotten turned around, which was impossible on a straight interstate highway, he'd be far past the city in the other direction by now. The mathematics didn't work. He was caught in something that violated the basic laws of distance and direction. Daniel decided to exit at the next ramp and turn around, head back to Albuquerque, and figure out what was happening. But as he drove, watching for exit signs, none appeared. The highway continued unbroken, mile after mile of straight asphalt cutting through the desert with no off-ramps visible. His GPS showed exits ahead, marked them clearly on the map, but when he reached their indicated positions, there was nothing but continuous roadway. "Albuquerque, 20 miles." The sign mocked him, its retro-reflective lettering blazing in his headlights. Daniel had now driven over 100 miles since departing the distribution center. The fuel gauge showed 3/4 full, about right for the distance traveled. The engine temperature was normal. Every indicator on his dashboard suggested routine operation, but the reality outside his windows contradicted everything. He tried the CB again, scanning through channels. "This is eastbound Torres on 40. Anybody out there?" Static answered him. He kept trying, calling out on every channel, but received no responses. The airwaves were dead, as if he were the only trucker on the road, the only person broadcasting into the New Mexico night. The landscape began cycling. Daniel noticed landmarks repeating themselves. A distinctively shaped mesa appeared on the horizon, then disappeared as he drove past, only to appear again 10 minutes later in exactly the same position. A billboard advertising a truck stop in Tucumcari showed up repeatedly, always indicating the same exit number, the same distance ahead. He was passing the same markers over and over, trapped in a loop that defied explanation. Albuquerque, 10 miles. Daniel's breath came faster. Panic crept into his thoughts, though he fought to maintain control. He'd been driving for nearly 2 hours, covered at least 140 miles, yet the signs insisted he was only 10 miles from where he'd started. His GPS had frozen, the blue dot on the screen no longer moving, stuck at a position somewhere east of his actual location, or wherever he actually was. More details became apparent as he studied the repeating landscape. The same rest area appeared every 15 minutes, though he never actually reached it. The structure remained perpetually on the horizon, visible in the distance but never getting closer. The pattern of stars overhead didn't change or shift as they should have during 2 hours of eastward driving. The moon held the same position, frozen in the sky like a painted backdrop. Daniel realized he wasn't covering any actual distance, despite the odometer continuing to count upward, despite the sensation of movement, despite his truck's engine working normally and the highway passing beneath his wheels. He wasn't actually traveling anywhere. He was caught in a single mile of roadway that repeated endlessly, a loop that made his eastward journey a futile exercise. Albuquerque, 5 miles. He'd been driving for 3 hours now. His eyes burned with fatigue and stress. The repetition of the landscape had become hypnotic, the same features cycling past in their established pattern. Mesa, billboard, rock formation, mileage sign. Mesa, billboard, rock formation, millage sign, an endless loop playing out under his headlights. Daniel tried turning around. He cranked the wheel hard, attempting to make his rig execute a tight turn that would point him back toward Albuquerque. But the truck wouldn't respond. The steering felt loose, disconnected, like it was no longer attached to the front wheels. His rig continued forward inexorably, locked onto its eastward trajectory through the impossible mile. The CB radio came to life with his own voice. He heard himself from 3 hours earlier, calling out for westbound drivers near Klein's Corners. The conversation he'd had with westbound Charlie played through the speaker, but distorted slightly, the words drawn out and echoing. Then his voice asking his question again, and Charlie responding. The same exchange repeating in an audio loop. Albuquerque, 1 mile. Daniel laughed, a sound without humor. 1 mile. After driving for nearly 4 hours, covering hundreds of miles according to his odometer, burning through gallons of diesel fuel, the signs claimed he was 1 mile from his starting point. He wondered what would happen when he reached zero. Would the loop reset? Would he finally break free of whatever had trapped him? Would something worse begin? The sign never reached zero. Daniel drove for another hour, watching the Albuquerque 1 mile sign appear and reappear, always indicating that same impossible distance. The loop had tightened to its final iteration, trapping him in the last mile before his starting point, a mile he could never actually traverse. His GPS remained frozen. His phone showed no signal. The CB radio played back his own voice in increasingly distorted loops, the words becoming meaningless sounds. Then, without warning or transition, everything snapped back to normal. The GPS came alive, updating rapidly as if catching up after a long freeze. His phone signal returned, showing multiple missed calls from his dispatcher. The CB radio burst with chatter from other truckers, and the landscape outside his windows suddenly looked right again. The familiar shapes and positions of the New Mexico desert matching his memories. A sign appeared ahead. Amarillo, 140 miles. Daniel checked his location. According to the GPS, he was right where he should have been 4 hours earlier, approximately 60 miles east of Albuquerque. The clock on his dashboard showed 1:15 a.m. He'd somehow lost 4 hours, or gained them back, or experienced them outside normal time. He couldn't tell which. Daniel pulled into the next truck stop, his hands shaking so badly he could barely control the wheel. He parked his rig and sat in the cab for an hour, trying to process what had happened. The odometer showed the extra hundreds of miles he'd driven during the loop. The fuel gauge reflected the diesel burned during those phantom hours. Physical evidence that his experience had been real, even though time itself seemed to have reset. He never filed a report about the incident. How could he explain it? Who would believe that he'd driven hundreds of miles while covering no actual distance, that he'd been trapped in a backwards mile that endlessly repeated itself? He completed the delivery to Amarillo, then drove back to Albuquerque. And when he passed through that stretch of Interstate 40 near Klein's Corners, He watched the odometer carefully, counting off every tenth of a mile, making sure the distance accumulated properly. Daniel still drives that route. He has to. It's part of his regular rotation. But now he always departs Albuquerque during daylight hours, never after dark. And when he passes mile marker 181, right where the loop trapped him, he keeps both hands tight on the wheel and his eyes locked on the road ahead, terrified that at any moment the signs might start counting backward again, dragging him into that impossible mile where distance has no meaning and the road goes nowhere forever. Story 3. The Screaming Cargo. Patricia Sullivan had hauled just about every type of freight imaginable during her 19 years as an owner-operator, from fresh produce to hazardous materials, from livestock to high-value electronics. She'd transported wedding dresses worth $100,000 and machine parts that weighed 15 tons. But the load she picked up in Detroit on October 7, 2022, was officially listed as simple warehouse equipment, and it would become the cargo that nearly destroyed her sanity. The pickup itself was unusual. Instead of a normal warehouse or distribution center, Patricia's GPS directed her to an industrial complex on the outskirts of Detroit that looked abandoned. Chain-link fencing surrounded buildings with broken windows and graffiti-covered walls. But when she pulled her Peterbilt 389 up to the gate, it swung open automatically, and a man in a dark suit appeared, waving her toward a specific loading dock. "Patricia Sullivan?" the man asked, consulting a tablet computer. His voice was flat, professional, emotionless. "That's me. I'm here for the load to Denver. Dock 7. We'll have you loaded in 20 minutes. Sign here." He thrust a digital pad toward her. Patricia signed, noting that the shipping documents were oddly vague. Warehouse equipment and fixtures was the only description provided. No itemized list, no detailed inventory. The weight was listed at 38,000 pounds, well within her truck's capacity. The loading process was efficient and silent. 4 workers in matching coveralls used a forklift to load large wooden crates into her trailer. Each crate was approximately 6 feet long, 3 feet wide, and 3 feet tall. Built from heavy wood and banded with metal straps. There were 12 crates total, arranged in careful rows inside the trailer. None of the workers spoke during the loading process. When they finished, they sealed the trailer with a numbered security tag and departed without a word. The man in the suit returned with her paperwork. Direct route to Denver. No stops except for fuel and legally required rest breaks. The cargo is time sensitive. You have 72 hours to complete delivery. "What exactly am I hauling?" Patricia asked, eyeing the sealed trailer behind her. "The paperwork describes the cargo, warehouse equipment and fixtures. Is there a problem, Miss Sullivan?" Something in his tone suggested she shouldn't ask further questions. Patricia had been trucking long enough to know when to push and when to let things go. The pay for this run was excellent, nearly double her normal rate for a Detroit to Denver haul. She accepted the documents and climbed back into her cab. The first 6 hours were normal. Patricia headed west on Interstate 70, the familiar rumble of her diesel engine a comforting presence as she rolled through Ohio and into Indiana. The trailer tracked well behind her, the load properly distributed and secured. She stopped once for fuel, pulled through a truck stop to grab a sandwich and use the restroom, then continued west into Illinois. The screaming started just after midnight, somewhere between Indianapolis and Terre Haute. At first, Patricia thought she'd imagined it. A faint sound, barely audible over the engine noise and road rumble, like distant voices crying out. She turned down her radio, listening carefully. The sound came again, louder now, definitely screaming. Multiple voices, men and women, howling in apparent agony. The sounds came from behind her, from inside the sealed trailer. Patricia immediately checked her mirrors, wondering if someone had somehow gotten into the trailer at the fuel stop, if she was unknowingly transporting stowaways. But that was impossible. The trailer had been sealed with the security tag, and she'd checked it after fueling. No one could have entered without breaking the seal. The screaming intensified. Now it sounded like dozens of voices, maybe hundreds, all crying out in a cacophony of horror. Patricia felt her hands go cold on the steering wheel. This wasn't possible. Warehouse equipment didn't scream. The cargo manifest hadn't mentioned anything living. She grabbed her CB radio. "This is Sullivan on 70 westbound near Terre Haute. Any trucks near my position?" A moment later, a response came through. "I'm about 2 miles ahead of you, Sullivan. Big Orange Kenworth. What do you need? You hear anything strange? Any unusual sounds?" "Negative. Roads are quiet tonight." "Why?" The screaming reached a crescendo, so loud now that Patricia wondered how the other driver couldn't hear it. The sounds weren't just audible anymore. She could feel them, vibrations traveling through the frame of her truck, up through the seat, into her bones. The voices wailed and shrieked, begging for help in words that were almost comprehensible, but not quite. "Never mind," she said into the CB. "Must be my radio acting up." Patricia pulled off at the next exit, guiding her rig into an empty rest area parking lot. The screaming continued unabated, the cacophony of voices showing no sign of diminishing. She climbed out of the cab and walked back to her trailer, hands shaking as she approached the sealed doors. Up close, the screaming was overwhelming. It definitely came from inside the trailer, the sounds emanating from between the metal panels, seeping out through the seams and rivets. Patricia pressed her hand against the trailer's side. The metal was ice cold, far colder than the mild October night could account for, and it vibrated, thrumming with the force of the sounds within. She considered breaking the seal and opening the trailer to check the cargo, but the man in Detroit had been clear. Direct route, no stops, and something instinctive warned her against looking inside. Whatever was producing those sounds, she didn't want to see it. Some deep survival instinct told her that opening the trailer would be catastrophic. Patricia climbed back into her cab and pulled out her cell phone, intending to call the number on the shipping documents. But when she looked at the paperwork, there was no phone number listed, no contact information at all except for delivery address in Denver. She tried calling the company name listed on the manifest, but directory assistants had no listing for any business by that name. The screaming faded as she sat in the cab, gradually diminishing until it was barely audible again. Patricia waited 15 minutes, then started her engine and pulled back onto the highway. As soon as she reached cruising speed, the screaming began again, building in intensity as she drove. For the next 8 hours, Patricia experienced a special kind of hell. The screaming never stopped completely. It would fade during rest stops and slowdowns, then surge back when she reached highway speeds. The sounds varied in intensity and character. Sometimes the voices sounded human, crying out in pain or terror. Other times they became animalistic, howls and shrieks that seemed to come from throats not shaped for human speech. She tried everything to block out the sounds. Turned her radio up as loud as it would go, blasting classic rock at deafening volume. Stuffed tissues in her ears, sang at the top of her lungs. Nothing helped. The screaming penetrated everything, bypassed her physical hearing, and resonated directly in her mind. Worse were the moments when the screaming resolved into actual words. Fragments of sentences, pleas and accusations. "Let us out. Why did you put us here? It's so cold and dark. Please help us. We've been here so long." The voices spoke in different languages, English and others. Patricia didn't recognize, but somehow she understood them all. They begged for release, for mercy, for death. They described impossible torments, spaces that existed outside normal reality, prisons that transcended physical dimensions. Patricia stopped for her legally mandated rest break at a truck stop in Kansas. She climbed into her sleeper berth, exhausted and shaking, but sleep was impossible. Even parked and stationary, she could hear faint screaming from the trailer, a continuous low-level wail that prevented any rest. She lay in her bunk, staring at the ceiling, wondering what she'd agreed to transport. What kind of cargo could possibly produce such sounds? At dawn, she checked the trailer again. The security seal remained intact. The wooden crates inside were visible through the gap between the trailer doors, exactly as they'd been loaded. But now frost covered the crate's surfaces, ice crystals glittering in the morning light, despite the fact that the temperature was in the mid-50s. Her breath fogged in the air near the trailer doors, though it was perfectly warm everywhere else. The second night of driving was worse than the first. The screaming became more organized, as if the voices had learned to coordinate their efforts. They began speaking in unison, hundreds of voices creating harmonies that shouldn't have been possible, frequencies that made Patricia's teeth ache and her vision blur. The sounds formed patterns, rhythms that seemed designed to break down her sanity through sheer repetition and discord. She passed other trucks on the highway and wondered what they heard. Did the screaming travel beyond her trailer? Could other drivers hear the cacophony? But when she asked over the CB, other truckers reported nothing unusual. The screaming existed only for her, the designated transporter of whatever nightmare cargo filled those wooden crates. By the third day, Patricia was hallucinating. Lack of sleep and the constant auditory assault had broken down her grip on reality. She saw things in her peripheral vision, shadows that moved wrong, figures standing by the roadside that vanished when she looked directly at them. The screams began showing her images, projecting visions directly into her mind. She saw vast spaces filled with writhing bodies, dimensions where the laws of physics didn't apply, realms of suffering that existed outside the normal universe. The final stretch into Denver was interminable. Patricia drove with tears streaming down her face, her hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel, fighting to maintain control of her rig while her mind threatened to shatter under the assault. The screaming had reached a fever pitch, so loud now that she couldn't hear her own thoughts, couldn't distinguish her own identity from the mass of tortured voices filling her consciousness. The delivery address led her to another industrial complex, this one outside Denver. Like the pickup location, it appeared abandoned, but had a gate that opened automatically as she approached. Men in dark suits waited at a loading dock, their faces expressionless as they directed her to back up her trailer. Patricia stumbled out of her cab, barely able to stand. One of the suited men approached her with a tablet. Sign here for delivery confirmation. What was I carrying? Patricia's voice was hoarse from shouting over the screaming. What the hell was in those crates? The man smiled, an expression without warmth or humanity. Equipment and fixtures as specified in your manifest. The cargo has been delivered intact. Your payment will be processed within 24 hours. They broke the security seal and opened her trailer. Workers began unloading the crates with the same silent efficiency as the loading crew in Detroit. Patricia watched, expecting to finally see what had tormented her for 3 days. But the crates remained sealed, their contents hidden within heavy wood and metal bands. They were carried into the building and disappeared into its dark interior. As the last crate was removed, the screaming stopped. The sudden silence was so complete, so absolute, that Patricia thought she'd gone deaf. She stood in the loading dock, ears ringing with phantom echoes, while the suited men completed their paperwork and sent her away. Patricia drove her empty trailer to a truck stop and slept for 18 hours straight. When she finally woke, she checked her bank account and found the payment had been deposited as promised. She also found a message from the same company, offering her another run, this one from Denver to Seattle, at triple her normal rate. She declined. Whatever was in those crates, whatever produced those sounds of suffering that still echoed in her nightmares, she wanted no part of it. Patricia Sullivan had hauled her last load for that company, had transported her last shipment of equipment and fixtures that screamed with 1,000 tortured voices. She still drives, still hauls freight across the country. But now she's careful about what load she accepts, reads manifests with paranoid attention to detail, asks questions when descriptions seem vague. And late at night, when the road is empty and quiet, she sometimes thinks she can still hear faint screaming from somewhere far behind her, carried on the wind from crates full of anguish being transported across America by other unsuspecting drivers who accepted runs they shouldn't have taken. Story 4. The Re-Piating Town. James Crawford had been running routes through Montana and Wyoming for 12 years, hauling everything from cattle feed to mining equipment across the sparse highways that connected isolated towns in the northern Rockies. The veteran driver from Billings knew the territory better than most, could navigate the region's challenging mountain passes and remote stretches of two-lane highway with practiced ease. On May 15, 2023, that familiarity became a liability when he encountered a town that shouldn't have existed and couldn't be escaped. The delivery was straightforward enough. James was hauling a load of construction materials from Billings to Gillette, Wyoming, a 4-hour run he'd made countless times before. He left Montana at 6 a.m., his International Longstar heavy with steel beams and cement bags. The weather was clear, the roads dry, and James was in good spirits as he rolled south on Highway 87, watching the sun climb higher over the rolling prairie landscape. Around 8:30 a.m., James passed through a small town he'd never noticed before. The highway sign identified it as Ashford, population 842. The town consisted of a single main street lined with small businesses. A gas station, a diner, a few shops, and a handful of houses visible on the side streets. Nothing about it seemed unusual or remarkable. Just another small Montana town like dozens of others scattered across the state. James continued south, but 20 minutes later, the same town appeared ahead of him. Same highway sign reading Ashford, population 842. Same main street with the same businesses in the same positions. He slowed his rig, studying the buildings carefully as he passed through. It wasn't just similar to the previous town. It was identical. The same crack in the sidewalk in front of the hardware store. The same faded American flag hanging from the same pole by the post office. The same blue pickup truck parked in front of the same diner. James checked his GPS. According to the device, he'd traveled 23 miles since passing through Ashford the first time. He was well south of that location, making good progress toward the Wyoming border, but the evidence before his eyes contradicted the GPS data. He was passing through the same town again. He pulled into the gas station, deciding to stop and ask directions, confirm his location. As he climbed down from his cab, James noticed a man pumping gas into a sedan. The man wore a red flannel shirt and a baseball cap. James approached him. "Excuse me, is this Ashford?" The man looked up, smiling. "Sure is. You lost, friend?" "No, I thought I passed through here already about 20 minutes ago." The man's smile didn't waver. "Well, you're here now. Have a good day." He finished pumping gas, got in his car, and drove away before James could ask anything else. James went into the gas station's convenience store. A woman stood behind the counter, middle-aged with gray hair and glasses. "Help you? I'm just trying to confirm my location. This is Ashford, Montana. Born and raised here," the woman said. "Is there a problem?" "I could have sworn I passed through this exact town earlier." The woman's expression didn't change. Highway 87 runs right through town. Lots of truckers pass through every day. James bought a coffee and returned to his truck, feeling unsettled but unable to pinpoint exactly why. The GPS still showed him on course, indicated he was making steady progress south. He pulled back onto the highway and continued his delivery. 15 minutes later, Ashford appeared ahead of him again. This time, James felt a jolt of real fear. The highway sign was identical. The town itself was identical. As he drove down the main street, he looked carefully at every detail. The crack in the sidewalk, the faded flag, the blue pickup truck in front of the diner, all exactly the same. And there, at the gas station, was the same man in the red flannel shirt and baseball cap, pumping gas into the same sedan. James didn't stop this time. He pressed harder on the accelerator, pushing his rig up to 60 miles per hour, racing through the small town and back out onto the open highway. His odometer continued counting upward. The GPS showed him moving south, but some part of him already knew what was going to happen. 12 minutes later, Ashford appeared again. James had now passed through the same town 4 times. He'd driven over 60 miles according to his odometer, but somehow kept returning to the same location. The town appeared with mechanical regularity, emerging from the Montana landscape like a recurring image in a broken film loop. He grabbed his CB radio. "Any southbound trucks on 87 near Ashford, you copy?" Static answered him. He tried again on different channels, called out repeatedly, but received no responses. The CB appeared to be functioning normally, but no one answered his calls. James decided to turn around. If he couldn't proceed south, he'd head north, return to Billings, report the problem to his dispatcher. He found a wide spot in the highway and carefully turned his 18-wheeler around, pointing the truck back the way he'd come. 10 minutes later, he entered Ashford from the south, driving north through the town. The buildings faced the opposite direction now, but they were the same structures, the same businesses. The gas station was on the other side of the street, but it was the same gas station. The diner was reversed, but still the same diner. Ashford existed in both directions, a symmetrical trap that couldn't be escaped by simply turning around. James continued north for 20 minutes, then the town appeared again. He was now trapped in a loop approximately 15 miles long, a stretch of Montana highway that repeated endlessly, with Ashford at its center. No matter which direction he drove, no matter how fast or slow, the town reappeared with inexorable regularity. He tried the side streets, turning off the main highway onto residential roads. These streets curved and twisted, past houses and yards, then inevitably led back to the main highway, dumping him right back onto 87, either north or south of the town center. Every side street was a loop that returned to the highway. There was no escape route hidden in the residential areas. By noon, James had passed through Ashford more than 30 times. He'd driven hundreds of miles in a circle, fuel gauge dropping steadily as he burned diesel in his futile attempts to break free. The town never changed. The crack in the sidewalk remained in exactly the same position. The flag never moved, hung limp from its pole regardless of wind conditions. And the man in the red flannel shirt was always at the gas station, eternally pumping gas into his sedan, looking up with the same smile whenever James drove past. James stopped at the diner, desperate for human interaction, for someone who could explain what was happening. He parked his truck and walked inside, a bell chiming as he pushed through the door. 3 people sat at the counter, and a waitress stood behind it, pot of coffee in hand. They all turned to look at him as he entered. "Welcome to Maggie's Diner," the waitress said. "Have a seat anywhere." James sat at the counter. "I need help. I'm trapped. I keep driving through this town over and over." The waitress poured him coffee without being asked. "Everyone passes through Ashford eventually. Highway goes right through the middle of town. You don't understand. I've passed through here 40 times today. I can't get out." The 3 other customers turned to stare at him. They all had the same neutral expression, the same slight smile. "Sounds like you should stay for lunch," one of them said. "I don't want lunch. I want directions out of this town." "Only one highway," the waitress said patiently. 87 goes north and south. You can't miss it." James realized none of them were going to help. They couldn't help. They were part of the town, part of the loop, as trapped as he was, but unable or unwilling to acknowledge it. He left the diner without drinking the coffee, climbed back into his truck, and continued driving. The afternoon passed in an increasingly surreal cycle. James drove through Ashford again and again, watched the same scenes play out with identical precision. The man at the gas station always pumped gas. The flag always hung motionless. The blue pickup truck never moved from its spot in front of the diner. Nothing in the town ever changed or progressed. It existed in a single frozen moment that repeated endlessly. James tried everything he could think of. He attempted to drive through yards and fields, taking his rig off-road to bypass the highway entirely. But the terrain always became too rough or too steep, forcing him back onto the pavement. He tried stopping completely, parking his truck and refusing to move, thinking maybe the loop required motion to function. But after sitting motionless for an hour, he started the engine again, and within minutes found himself back in Ashford, the loop reasserting itself. His cell phone showed no signal. The GPS had frozen, displaying his last known position on the outskirts of Billings, hours before he'd first entered the town. The CB radio remained silent except for occasional bursts of static. James was completely isolated, trapped in his endlessly repeating circuit through a town that defied reality. As evening approached, James began noticing more subtle wrongness in Ashford. The shadows fell at impossible angles, not matching the sun's position in the sky. The temperature inside the town limits was always exactly 72 degrees, regardless of what the thermometer showed outside the town boundaries. The people he saw, the few residents visible on the streets, moved with slight delays, as if reality were buffering like a slow internet connection. Night fell, and James continued driving, now primarily because he was too frightened to stop. His headlights illuminated the same streets, the same buildings, the same eternally pumping gas station patron. In the darkness, the town looked even more artificial, like a movie set or stage play rather than a real location. The streetlights cast pools of orange light that didn't quite behave properly, that seemed painted onto the scene rather than generated by actual bulbs. James had passed through Ashford more than 200 times when something finally changed. As he entered the town on his 207th circuit, the gas station was empty. The man in the red flannel shirt was gone. The sedan was gone. The gas pumps stood idle. Hope surged in James's chest. Maybe the loop was breaking. Maybe he was finally going to escape. He pressed harder on the accelerator, rushing through the town. But as he passed the diner, he saw the man in the red flannel shirt inside, sitting at the counter with the same neutral smile. The loop hadn't broken. It had simply shifted slightly, adjusted some minor detail while maintaining its essential structure. Over the following hours, more small changes occurred. The blue pickup truck moved to a different parking spot. The flag raised and lowered. People appeared and disappeared from the street. But these changes only made the loop more horrifying. Proved that Ashford wasn't simply a recording playing on repeat. It was somehow alive, aware, deliberately holding him prisoner. James drove through the night in a state of numbing terror and exhaustion. His fuel gauge approached empty. He'd burned an entire tank of diesel driving in circles, and there was no way out. The realization hit him that he might die in this loop, might run out of fuel and sit stranded in Ashford forever. Just another element in the town's frozen tableau. As dawn broke on his second day in the loop, James was approaching the town for the 309th time when the highway sign was different. Instead of Ashford, population 842, it read Ashford, population 843. James slammed on his brakes, bringing his rig to a skidding stop in the middle of the highway. The population had increased by one. Him. The town had counted him as a resident. He stared at the sign, understanding the implication. He wasn't passing through anymore. Ashford had claimed him. Then, without warning or transition, James found himself 50 miles south of Ashford, back on Highway 87, approaching the Wyoming border. His GPS came alive, updating rapidly. His phone signal returned. The CB radio burst with chatter from other truckers. The world snapped back to normal as if the previous 24 hours had never happened. But his odometer showed the extra 400-plus miles he'd driven. His fuel tank was nearly empty, and when he looked in his rearview mirror, he could see dust covering his trailer, far more than should have accumulated during a normal 4-hour drive. Physical evidence that his experience had been real. James completed the delivery to Gillette, then immediately drove back to Billings. He never ran that route again. Whenever his dispatcher tried to assign him loads going south on Highway 87, James refused them, claiming mechanical issues or family emergencies or any excuse he could invent. He would never risk passing through Ashford again. Sometimes, late at night, James pulls up online maps and searches for the town. It's never there. No town named Ashford exists in Montana, according to any database or directory. The population never existed. But James knows it's out there somewhere, waiting on Highway 87, ready to trap the next unsuspecting driver who passes through its boundaries. A town that doesn't exist on any map, but exists in a loop of its own reality, collecting travelers and holding them in endless repeating cycles until it decides to release them, or doesn't. Story 5, The Static Passenger. Raymond Wu had been hauling freight for 18 years without ever carrying a passenger. But on November 3, 2022, something climbed into his cab on a dark stretch, Interstate 90 in South Dakota, and it refused to leave. The entity that called itself Sarah manifested first as static on the CB radio, then as a voice, and finally as something that sat in the passenger seat, but couldn't properly be called human. Raymond's route that night was simple. Sioux Falls to Rapid City, a 4-hour drive across the flat eastern portion of South Dakota into the more rugged Black Hills region. He was hauling agricultural equipment, grain augers and irrigation parts destined for farms in the western part of the state. The load was light, only 23,000 pounds, and Raymond's Volvo VNL tracked smooth and stable down the interstate. He departed Sioux Falls at 10 p.m. planning to reach Rapid City around 2 in the morning. The weather was cold but clear, temperature in the low 30s. Light traffic moved on the interstate, mostly other commercial trucks making nighttime runs. Raymond had his radio tuned to a classic rock station, keeping himself alert with coffee from his thermos. Around midnight, somewhere between Chamberlain and Murdo, the CB radio started acting strangely. Static bursts interrupted the normal chatter between truckers. Not random interference, but patterns of noise that almost sounded structured, like speech broken down into its component frequencies. Raymond adjusted the squelch control, thinking the radio was picking up interference from some nearby source. The static coalesced into a voice. Female, young-sounding, distorted by layers of electronic noise. "Can anyone hear me?" Raymond keyed his mic. "This is eastbound Wu on 90. I hear you, but you're coming through with a lot of static. Try adjusting your radio." "Thank God, I've been trying to reach someone for so long. I'm stuck." "Where are you stuck? Do you need me to call for help?" "I don't know where I am. It's dark. I can't see anything. But I can hear you. I can hear your truck." Raymond checked his mirrors, looking for any vehicles that might be in distress on the roadside. The highway behind him was empty except for distant headlights. "I don't see anyone pulled over. What's your location?" I'm close. Very close. Please, I need help. Can you stop? Can you let me in?" Something about the request triggered alarm bells in Raymond's mind. Let her in? Into what? He keyed the CB again. "Miss, I'm going to call the highway patrol to assist you. Stay where you are." "No." The voice crackled with sudden intensity. "Don't call anyone else, just you. Only you can help me. Please, I'm so cold. It's so dark here. Let me in." Raymond grabbed his cell phone, intending to call for help regardless of what the voice wanted. But before he could dial, the temperature inside his cab dropped precipitously. His breath fogged in the air, and frost spread across the inside of the windshield. The radio cut to pure static, a wall of white noise that drowned out everything else. Then someone was sitting in the passenger seat. Raymond jerked in shock, nearly losing control of his truck. One moment the seat had been empty, holding only his jacket and a road atlas. The next moment a young woman sat there, maybe 20 years old, wearing jeans and a faded t-shirt. She looked solid and real, but something was fundamentally wrong with her appearance. Her edges flickered, like a television image with poor reception. Static snow danced across her skin, and her eyes were dark holes filled with roiling electronic noise. "Thank you," she said, and her voice came from both her mouth and the CB radio simultaneously, creating an unsettling stereo effect. "Thank you for letting me in. I didn't let you in. Who are you?" "What are you?" "My name is Sarah. I've been trying to reach someone for a very long time." Raymond's hands trembled on the steering wheel. Every instinct screamed at him to stop the truck and flee. But he was traveling at 70 miles per hour on an interstate highway with a full load behind him. He couldn't just abandon his rig. "Where did you come from?" "I died here," Sarah said, gesturing vaguely at the darkness outside. Her hand left trails of static in the air, distorted after images that took seconds to fade. November 3rd, 2007. 15 years ago tonight, I was a passenger in a car. We crashed in a snowstorm. The car went off the road and down an embankment. I was thrown from the vehicle. I'm sorry, but that doesn't explain how you're here now in my truck. I'm not really here. Not in the way you mean. I'm somewhere else. Somewhere dark and cold and full of static. But tonight, on the anniversary of my death, I can reach through. I can find someone on this highway, and I can ride with them. Raymond tried to process this. "You're a ghost?" Sarah's flickering face showed something that might have been a smile. "I don't know what I am. I'm trapped between states, between living and dying, between reality and whatever comes after. Every year on this night I can manifest like this, and every year I ride with someone." Okay, fine. What do you want from me? Just company, just someone to talk to. Do you know how lonely it is, being trapped in static for 364 days of the year? This is my one night to be almost human again. Raymond drove in silence for a moment, trying to decide if he was hallucinating. But the cold in the cab was real. The frost on the windshield was real. And Sarah, whatever she was, showed no signs of disappearing. You do this every year? Hitch a ride with some random trucker? Not always truckers, sometimes car drivers. Once a motorcyclist, though that was difficult. I don't choose. I reach out, and whoever responds, whoever hears my voice on the radio, or however I can manifest that year, that's who I ride with. What happens if I refuse? What if I pull over and tell you to get out? The static intensified around Sarah's form. You can't refuse. You already responded. You let me establish connection. I'm here until dawn or until we reach Rapid City, whichever comes first. Those are the rules. What rules? Who makes these rules? I don't know, but they're absolute. I've learned them over 15 years of repetition. Raymond felt a headache forming behind his eyes. This was insane. He was hallucinating from exhaustion, or carbon monoxide was leaking into his cab, or he'd had a stroke, and this was some dying dream. But the entity that called itself Sarah remained solid in his passenger seat. Her static-filled form a constant reminder that something impossible was happening. Fine, he said eventually. You want company. You've got it. But no tricks, no trying to cause an accident, no making me drive off the road. I would never do that. I know what it's like to die in a highway accident. I wouldn't wish that on anyone. They drove in uneasy silence for several miles. Raymond kept glancing at Sarah, trying to understand what he was seeing. Her form maintained general human shape, but the details were never quite stable. Her face shifted subtly, features rearranging themselves in small ways, like someone adjusting focus on a camera. The static that composed her body flowed and swirled in patterns that hurt to watch for too long. Tell me about yourself, Sarah said, breaking the silence. Where are you from? Do you have family? Born in Seattle. Been trucking for 18 years. I have a wife and 2 kids, boy and a girl, both in high school now. That sounds nice. I never had kids. Never got the chance. I was 20 years old when I died. Had just started my junior year of college. Was driving home for Thanksgiving break when the storm hit. I'm sorry. It's been 15 years. The pain of it has faded to something more like nostalgia. I remember being alive, remember my family and friends, but it feels distant now, like it happened to someone else. They talked for over an hour, an increasingly surreal conversation between a trucker and a ghost made of static. Sarah asked about Raymond's life, his family, his experiences on the road. She seemed genuinely interested, hungry for details about the world she could no longer participate in. In return, she told him about her death, about the moments after the crash when she'd lain in the snow watching her life fade away. The transition wasn't instantaneous, Sarah explained. There were several minutes between the impact and when I actually died. I remember the cold, the pain, the slow realization that I wasn't going to survive, and then everything became static, like someone had tuned my consciousness to a dead channel. I've been trapped in that state ever since. Why? Raymond asked. Why are you trapped? Why haven't you moved on? I don't know. Maybe I'm not supposed to move on. Maybe this is my afterlife, existing a static noise between moments, reaching out once a year to touch the living world. Maybe I did something wrong, and this is punishment. Or maybe it's just random, meaningless, the way my particular death happened to align with some quirk of reality. The conversation took on a strange intimacy. Talking to Sarah was easier than Raymond expected, once he'd accepted the impossibility of her presence. She was articulate and thoughtful, her memories of life still vivid despite 15 years of death. They discussed philosophy and religion, debated the nature of consciousness, wondered about the mechanisms that might allow a dead person to manifest as electromagnetic phenomena. But as they talked, Raymond noticed Sarah's form degrading. The static that composed her grew more chaotic, less organized into human shape. Her voice developed more distortion, words becoming harder to understand. She seemed to be losing cohesion, unraveling back into pure noise. It's almost dawn, Sarah said, her voice now heavily processed through layers of interference. I can feel the connection weakening. Soon I'll snap back to the static place and I won't emerge again for another year. Will you remember this conversation? I remember all of them. Every year, every person I've ridden with, I hold on to those memories in the dark times. They're all I have. I'm sorry you're trapped like this. Don't be. This is better than nothing. For one night a year, I get to be almost human again. I get to ride through the world, see things, talk to people. It's enough. It has to be enough. They were approaching Rapid City when the first light of dawn appeared on the eastern horizon. Sarah's form flickered more rapidly now, large sections of her body losing cohesion and dissolving into formless static. Her face was barely recognizable, features scattered across a field of electronic snow. Thank you, Raymond, she said, her voice almost completely lost to noise. Thank you for not being afraid, for talking to me, for treating me like I was still human. You've given me a good memory to carry forward. Will you be okay? In the static place? I'll survive. I always do. And next November 3rd, I'll reach out again, find someone else to ride with. Maybe I'll find you again someday, if our paths cross on the right night. I hope not, Raymond said, then immediately felt guilty. I mean, I hope you find peace. I hope you move on to whatever comes after this. Sarah's laugh was pure static now, a burst of white noise that shook the speakers. Maybe someday. Until then, I have my one night a year. The sun broke over the horizon and Sarah vanished instantly, like a television being switched off. One moment she was there, fragmenting into noise, and the next the passenger seat was empty except for Raymond's jacket and road atlas. The temperature in the cab immediately returned to normal. The frost on the windshield evaporated in seconds. Raymond pulled into Rapid City and completed his delivery in a daze. He went through the motions automatically, getting paperwork signed, having his trailer unloaded, but his mind was elsewhere. Had he really spent 4 hours talking to a ghost? The experience was already taking on a dreamlike quality, details becoming fuzzy and uncertain. He found a truck stop and tried to sleep, but couldn't. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Sarah's static-filled form flickering in his passenger seat. He heard her voice layered over electronic noise, talking about loneliness and darkness and the one night a year when she could touch the world of the living. Raymond drove that route many times over the following year, but he avoided it on November 3rd. When that date approached, he made sure to schedule runs that kept him far from South Dakota. He told himself it was just caution, just avoiding an unpleasant memory, but deep down he knew he was afraid that Sarah would reach out again, would find him on the anniversary of her death and climb into his cab for another night of impossible conversation. Years have passed now. Raymond still drives, still hauls freight across America's highways. And every November 3rd, wherever he is, he turns off his CB radio before sunset and doesn't turn it back on until dawn. He won't listen to the static, won't risk hearing that distorted voice calling out for help. He gave Sarah one night of company, one memory to carry forward into her darkness, but he can't do it again. Some encounters with the impossible are too disturbing to repeat, even when they come from someone desperately lonely and trapped between states of existence. Sarah rides with someone else now on her anniversary night, finds new companions to share her annual escape from static, and Raymond drives on, grateful and guilty in equal measure, carrying his own memory of the passenger who wasn't really there. Story 6, the Ian Day/Tunnel. Kenneth Harris had driven through hundreds of tunnels during his 21 years as a commercial truck driver, from the short mountain pass tunnels of Colorado to the lengthy underwater crossings of the Chesapeake Bay. Tunnels were routine, just another infrastructure feature on America's highway system. But the tunnel Kenneth entered on June 12, 2023, somewhere in the Appalachian Mountains of West Virginia, had no exit, and it would nearly cost him his sanity. The run itself was standard. Kenneth was hauling auto parts from Detroit to Charlotte, a route that took him through Ohio, cutting across the northern edge of West Virginia and down through Virginia into North Carolina. His Mack Anthem was loaded with transmissions and engine components, carefully secured in his trailer. The weather was overcast but dry, temperature mild for early summer. Kenneth entered West Virginia around 2 p.m., following Interstate 77 south through the Appalachian Highlands. The terrain was mountainous, the highway cutting through steep ridges and valleys, requiring careful attention to the road's curves and grades. Kenneth was an experienced mountain driver, knew how to manage his speed on descents, how to use his engine brake effectively. Around 3:30 p.m., the highway entered a tunnel. The entrance appeared normal, a standard mountain tunnel with the usual signage indicating length and clearance height. The sign outside read, Parson Tunnel, 1.2 miles. Kenneth had driven through this tunnel before on previous runs, knew it as an unremarkable passage through a ridge. He guided his truck into the tunnel, headlights automatically illuminating the concrete walls. The familiar echo of engine noise surrounded him, amplified by the enclosed space. Overhead lights cast pools of yellow illumination at regular intervals. Traffic was light, only one car visible ahead of him in the tunnel. Kenneth drove for several minutes, but the tunnel exit didn't appear. He'd covered at least 1.5 miles, well beyond the indicated length, yet the concrete walls continued ahead without any sign of the opening at the far end. The overhead lights stretched on into the distance, an endless row of yellow circles fading into perspective. He checked his odometer. 2 miles, 2.5 miles, 3 miles. The tunnel continued, unchanging, the same concrete walls and overhead lights repeating endlessly. The car that had been ahead of him was no longer visible. Kenneth was alone in the tunnel, enclosed in an impossible length of concrete and darkness. His GPS lost signal inside the tunnel, the screen displaying searching for satellites as it tried unsuccessfully to locate his position. The CB radio emitted only static, the thick walls of the tunnel blocking all outside signals. Kenneth's cell phone showed no service. He was completely isolated, cut off from all external communication. The tunnel showed no variation. Every section looked identical to the last. The same gray concrete, the same yellow lights spaced at the same intervals. Kenneth began watching for imperfections, trying to find unique markers that would indicate he was actually making forward progress. But the walls were featureless, perfectly uniform. Either the tunnel was genuinely endless, or he was somehow traveling through the same section repeatedly. After 10 miles, Kenneth's hands began to sweat on the steering wheel. This wasn't possible. Tunnels had exits. The longest highway tunnel in America was barely 2 miles. Yet he'd now driven 5 times that distance with no sign of the far end. The overhead lights continued their regular spacing, creating a hypnotic rhythm that made it difficult to judge actual distance traveled. He tried slowing down, thinking maybe his perception was off, maybe he was somehow missing the exit by approaching it too quickly. But even at 40 miles per hour, then 30, the tunnel continued unchanging ahead of him. The exit remained perpetually beyond reach, always just out of sight around the next curve, except there were no curves, just straight tunnel extending into infinity. The psychological impact of the enclosed space began affecting Kenneth. The concrete walls seemed to press in from both sides, and the ceiling felt lower despite his truck's clearance remaining constant. His breathing became shallow, and he recognized the onset of claustrophobia, something he'd never experienced before despite spending 2 decades in the confined spaces of truck cabs. Kenneth had covered 20 miles inside the tunnel when he saw something ahead. A figure stood beside the road, visible in the cone of his headlights. As he approached, Kenneth could see it was a man wearing what looked like a highway maintenance uniform. The figure waved, flagging Kenneth down. Kenneth brought his truck to a stop, grateful for any human contact in the endless tunnel. He rolled down his window as the man approached. "Thank God. Can you tell me how much farther to the exit?" The man's face was expressionless. "There is no exit." "What do you mean there's no exit? Every tunnel has an exit. Not this one. This tunnel just goes on. Forever, I think. Or at least until you give up." "That's impossible. I entered from Interstate 77. There has to be an exit onto the same highway." The man shook his head slowly. "I entered this tunnel in May of 2019. I've been here ever since. Sometimes I drive, sometimes I walk, but the tunnel never ends. Eventually I ran out of fuel and just started walking. I've walked for years now." Kenneth felt ice water flood his veins. "You've been in this tunnel for 4 years? Time works differently here. It might be 4 years, might be longer. Hard to keep track. I stopped counting after the first few months. But you'd need food, water. How have you survived? I don't know. I don't seem to need food or water anymore. Or sleep. I just exist here, walking through the tunnel, sometimes encountering other people like you. Other people? There are other people trapped here. Occasionally, not often, every few months, someone new enters the tunnel. Some of them keep driving, convinced they'll find the exit. Others accept the situation faster and join those of us who've stopped moving. There are maybe 30 of us in total, spread out along the tunnel's length. Kenneth's mind reeled. This couldn't be real. But the evidence was in front of him. The endless tunnel, the maintenance worker who'd been trapped for years. Reality had somehow broken down when he entered this mountain passage. How do I get out? I don't know if you can. Like I said, some people just keep driving, convinced the exit is ahead. Maybe they find it eventually. Or maybe they just drive forever. I don't know what happens to them. I'm not staying here. I have a family, a job, a life outside this tunnel. We all did. Kenneth put his truck in gear and drove away from the maintenance worker who stood watching with his expressionless face as the truck's taillights faded into the distance. Kenneth pushed his speed back up to 60, determined to escape through sheer persistence. He would drive until his fuel ran out if necessary, but he would find the exit. 30 miles, 40 miles, 50 miles. The tunnel continued, unchanging and eternal. Kenneth's fuel gauge dropped steadily, the needle moving toward the half-tank mark. He'd have to find the exit soon or risk running out of fuel and ending up like the maintenance worker. Trapped and walking forever through concrete corridors. More figures appeared along the roadside as Kenneth drove deeper into the tunnel. Men and women in various types of clothing from different eras. A woman in a 1950s-style dress stood motionless beside the wall. A man in 70s-era bell-bottoms sat on the concrete floor. A young person in modern clothes walked slowly along the shoulder. All of them watched Kenneth's truck pass with the same blank expression, the look of people who'd given up hope long ago. Kenneth tried honking his horn, the sound echoing deafeningly in the enclosed space. Maybe noise could break whatever spell held him. Maybe the tunnel would respond to sound, collapse or transform or release him. But nothing changed. The horn blast faded, and the tunnel remained as it had been, endless and indifferent. The air in the tunnel never changed. It remained at a constant cool temperature, never stale despite the lack of fresh air circulation. The lights never flickered or failed, maintained by some impossible power source that kept them illuminated eternally. Everything about the tunnel suggested it existed outside normal physics, operating by rules that had nothing to do with engineering or geography. After 60 miles, Kenneth's resolve began to crack. He'd driven the equivalent of a cross-country journey while trapped in a single tunnel. His fuel gauge approached quarter tank. Soon he'd be stranded, forced to abandon his truck and join the wandering souls he'd passed along the way. The thought terrified him more than anything else. Kenneth started praying, something he hadn't done since childhood. He begged whatever power controlled the tunnel to release him, promised to be a better person, to appreciate his life more, to never take simple things like open sky and fresh air for granted. The prayers seemed to vanish into the concrete walls, absorbed by the tunnel's indifferent structure. At 73 miles, something changed. Kenneth noticed a curve ahead, a slight bend in the tunnel's path. It was the first variation he'd seen in over 2 hours of driving. Hope surged in his chest. Maybe the curve led to the exit. Maybe the tunnel finally ended around that bend. He accelerated, pushing his truck up to 70 miles per hour, racing toward the curve. As he rounded it, the tunnel straightened out again, but now Kenneth could see something in the distance. Light. Not the yellow overhead lights, but natural daylight, the unmistakable brightness of the outside world. The exit was there, finally visible after 73 impossible miles. Kenneth pressed harder on the accelerator, pushing his truck as fast as he dared in the tunnel. The exit grew larger, the circle of daylight expanding. He could see trees beyond the opening, sea blue sky. Freedom was ahead, just seconds away. His truck burst out of the tunnel into brilliant afternoon sunshine. Kenneth blinked against the sudden light, his eyes watering after the extended time in the tunnel's dim illumination. He immediately pulled onto the shoulder and stopped, hands shaking so badly he could barely control the wheel. He climbed down from his cab and looked back at the tunnel he just exited. It looked completely normal. A standard mountain tunnel with a sign reading Parson Tunnel, 1.2 miles. As if nothing unusual had happened, as if Kenneth hadn't just driven 73 miles through an impossible space. His GPS came back online, showing his position on Interstate 77, exactly where he should have been after passing through the Parson Tunnel. According to the GPS, he'd been inside the tunnel for exactly 3 minutes. But Kenneth looked at his odometer, which showed the extra 73 miles. He looked at his fuel gauge, which had dropped from 3/4 full to nearly empty. Physical evidence that proved his experience had been real, despite what his GPS claimed about time and distance. Kenneth checked his phone. No calls, no messages, no indication that significant time had passed. According to his phone's clock, it was 3:33 p.m., exactly 3 minutes after he'd entered the tunnel, according to his last memory of checking the time. But those had been the longest 3 minutes of his life, stretched somehow into hours of driving through endless concrete corridors. He tried to continue his delivery to Charlotte, but found he couldn't drive. His hands shook too badly to safely operate his rig. Kenneth pulled into a rest area and sat for 2 hours trying to process what had happened. He'd entered a normal tunnel and experienced something impossible. Driven through space that couldn't exist, encountered people trapped for years in a prison of concrete and artificial light. Eventually, Kenneth called his dispatcher and reported a mechanical issue, claimed he needed to stop for repairs. He spent the night at a truck stop, sleeping fitfully in his cab, waking repeatedly from nightmares of endless tunnels and trapped souls walking forever through artificial corridors. The next day, Kenneth completed his delivery, but the experience had changed him. He became intensely averse to tunnels, would plan routes to avoid them even if it added hours to his trip. When tunnels were unavoidable, he drove through them in a state of barely controlled panic, watching his odometer constantly, counting off the distance to make sure he was actually progressing toward the exit. Kenneth never drove through the Parson Tunnel again. Whenever his routes took him through West Virginia on Interstate 77, he'd take a lengthy detour, adding 50 miles to his trip rather than risk entering that particular passage through the mountain. He knew the tunnel looked normal, knew other drivers passed through it every day without incident, but Kenneth also knew what lay inside. The impossible space that could open up and trap unwary travelers. The endless concrete corridor that some people never escaped. Years later, Kenneth still drives professionally, but he carries deep psychological scars from his 3 minutes or 2 hours or however long he actually spent inside that tunnel. He knows that somewhere in the Appalachian Mountains, there's a passage that doesn't follow normal rules, a tunnel that can expand to contain infinity, trapping the unlucky in eternal transit through concrete corridors. And he knows that right now, at this very moment, there are people walking through that endless space. The trapped souls he'd glimpsed during his journey, still searching for an exit that might never come. Story 7. The Mirror Fleet. Angela Martinez had been hauling refrigerated goods for 17 years, specializing in the temperature-controlled transport of produce and pharmaceuticals. She took pride in her work, maintained her Freightliner Coronado meticulously, and had a spotless safety record. On August 19, 2022, while driving through Nevada on US Highway 50, Angela encountered a version of herself driving in the opposite direction, and then another, and another, until the highway was filled with impossible duplicates. The delivery was time-sensitive, a load of temperature-critical medications from Reno to Delta, Utah, a 6-hour run across Nevada's remote interior. Angela departed Reno at 11 p.m., preferring night driving for refrigerated loads to reduce the strain on her cooling equipment. The highway stretched across the Great Basin, one of the loneliest roads in America, passing through vast stretches of desert with minimal towns or services. Highway 50 earned its nickname the loneliest road in America, honestly. For miles at a time, Angela would see no other vehicles, no lights, no signs of human presence except the highway itself cutting through endless sagebrush and sand. The isolation was peaceful usually, gave her time to think and listen to audiobooks. But tonight, the isolation felt oppressive, the darkness beyond her headlights pressing in like a physical weight. Around 1 a.m., Angela passed through the small town of Austin, Nevada. Population barely 200. The town was dark except for a single gas station, closed for the night but leaving its sign illuminated. Angela didn't stop, had enough fuel to reach Delta without refilling. "10 miles east of Austin, Angela saw headlights approaching from ahead. Another vehicle was westbound on Highway 50, rare enough at this hour to be noteworthy. As the vehicle drew closer, Angela realized it was a truck, a big rig like hers. The headlight pattern looked familiar. The truck passed her, and in that brief moment of illumination, Angela saw the driver. It was her. An identical version of Angela Martinez sat behind the wheel of the westbound truck. Same face, same expression, same everything. The truck itself was identical to Angela's rig. Same model, Fearline, same refrigerated trailer, even the same company logo on the door. Angela jerked in shock, nearly swerving into the oncoming lane. She checked her rearview mirror, but the truck's taillights were already disappearing into the darkness behind her. Had she imagined it? The encounter had been so brief, just a flash of illumination through two passing windshields. Maybe fatigue was playing tricks on her perception. 5 minutes later, another westbound truck approached. Same Fearline, same refrigerated trailer. And as it passed, Angela saw herself again behind the wheel, identical down to the flannel shirt she was wearing tonight. This time, the other Angela seemed to notice her too. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second, and Angela saw shock and confusion in her duplicate's face. Angela slowed her truck, heart pounding. This wasn't fatigue or misperception. She just passed two identical versions of herself driving in the opposite direction. The probability of such a thing occurring by random chance was essentially zero. Something impossible was happening on Highway 50 tonight. A third westbound truck appeared, then a fourth, then a fifth. Each one was an exact duplicate of Angela's rig, and each one was driven by an identical version of Angela Martinez. Some of the duplicates stared straight ahead, seemingly unaware of the encounter. Others looked over in shock, their faces showing the same confused terror that Angela felt. Within 20 minutes, Angela had passed more than 30 westbound versions of herself. The eastbound lane remained empty except for her truck, but the westbound lane had become a steady stream of duplicates, one appearing every minute or two, an endless convoy of identical vehicles, driven by identical drivers. Angela pulled onto the shoulder and stopped, unable to continue. Her hand shook violently on the steering wheel. This violated every law of physics and logic. People didn't have duplicates. Trucks didn't spontaneously replicate. Yet she just witnessed impossible numbers of herself driving past in perfect replication. She grabbed her CB radio. "This is eastbound Angela on 50. Anybody out there?" No response. She tried her cell phone but had no signal. The isolation of Highway 50 meant cellular coverage was essentially non-existent for long stretches. Angela was completely alone, unable to communicate with anyone about what was happening. The westbound duplicates continued to pass. Angela sat on the shoulder, watching in horror as truck after truck rolled by, each one carrying an identical version of herself. She tried to count them, lost track after 93. The stream seemed endless, a procession of mirrors driving through the Nevada night. Angela forced herself to start driving again. Whatever was happening, she needed to escape it. Needed to reach populated areas where reality might behave normally. She pulled back onto the highway and continued east, her truck's headlights cutting through the darkness. But now eastbound trucks began appearing ahead of her. Angela's own face looked back at her from mirrors as she passed slower-moving duplicates. The eastbound lane filled with versions of herself, all driving in the same direction, all heading toward Delta, Utah. Angela was surrounded by herself, trapped in a fleet of impossible duplicates. The trucks maintained slightly different speeds, creating a complex dance of passing and being passed. Angela would overtake a slower duplicate, pull into the passing lane and see another version of herself approaching from behind, moving faster. The highway became crowded with Angela's truck, dozens of identical rigs all occupying the same stretch of Highway 50. What horrified Angela most was the awareness in the duplicates' faces. They weren't automatons or simple copies. Each duplicate was conscious, reacted with shock and fear when they noticed other versions of themselves. Angela made eye contact with duplicate after duplicate, saw her own terror reflected back at her from multiple identical faces. Each copy was equally real, equally confused, equally trapped in this nightmare multiplication. Angela tried to find some pattern or explanation. Maybe these weren't duplicates. Maybe she'd somehow entered a parallel dimension where multiple versions of herself existed simultaneously. Or maybe she was experiencing a psychotic break, hallucinating the entire event. But the physical reality of the trucks was undeniable. She could hear their diesel engines, see the spray of debris from their tires, feel the displacement of air as they passed. These weren't hallucinations. They were real, solid, physical objects sharing the highway with her. The multiplication accelerated. Now Angela passed duplicate trucks every few seconds. The eastbound lane became a solid convoy of identical refrigerated trucks, bumper to bumper, all driven by identical Angela Martinizes. The westbound lane showed the same density. Highway 50 had become a corridor of mirrors, an endless reflection of a single truck and driver replicated into infinity. Angela noticed variations between duplicates as she studied them more carefully. Some showed signs of damage, dents or scratches on their trucks that Angela's own rig didn't have. Others appeared brand new, their paint pristine and unmarked. A few displayed the same damage patterns Angela's truck had accumulated over years of driving, suggesting they were true duplicates. But most showed slight variations, as if each copy represented a slightly different timeline or history. One duplicate drove with her window open despite the cold night air. Another had visible damage to her mirror assembly. A third appeared to be crying, tears streaming down her face as she gripped the steering wheel. Each version was experiencing the duplication differently, responding to the impossibility in individual ways despite their identical appearances. The landscape outside began changing. The sagebrush and sand of the Great Basin flickered and shifted, sometimes appearing normal, sometimes transforming into impossible geometries. The highway multiplied along with the trucks, dozens of parallel roads occupying the same space, all carrying identical trucks toward identical destinations. Reality was breaking down, fragmenting into infinite copies of a single moment stretched across impossible space. Angela tried to remember details of her departure from Reno, tried to find some point where things might have gone wrong, where she might have accidentally triggered this multiplication. But everything had been normal. She'd loaded her truck normally, driven normally, followed her usual route. There had been no warning, no moment of transition. The duplicates had simply started appearing, gradually increasing in number until they filled the highway completely. Around 3 a.m., the duplicates began to fade. Angela first noticed it in the westbound lane, where gaps started appearing between the trucks. One moment, the lane was solid with duplicates. The next moment, only every third or fourth truck remained. The process accelerated, duplicates vanishing like television static, resolving into clear picture. Within 10 minutes, the highway was empty except for Angela's own truck. She drove alone again through the Nevada darkness, the familiar isolation of Highway 50 returning as if the previous 2 hours of multiplication had never occurred. No traces remained of the duplicate trucks, except for the memories burned into Angela's mind and the shaking of her hands on the steering wheel. Angela reached Delta, Utah, at dawn and completed her delivery in a state of numb shock. She spoke to no one about what had happened, knew that any description of duplicate trucks and multiplying realities would sound like the ravings of someone in serious mental distress. She accepted the paperwork confirmation, climbed back into her cab, and sat for an hour trying to process the experience. The return trip to Reno was uneventful. Highway 50 looked normal, the same lonely desert highway it had always been. Angela saw no duplicates, no multiplying reality, no impossible fleet of mirror trucks. Everything had returned to normal, leaving her to wonder if she'd experienced some form of psychotic episode, or if reality itself had briefly fractured on that remote Nevada highway. But Angela knew what she'd seen. The encounter had been too detailed, too persistent to be simple hallucination. She'd experienced something genuine, some breakdown or multiplication of reality that allowed her to see and interact with infinite versions of herself. The implications were terrifying. If reality could fracture that way once, it could do so again. At any moment, the world might split and multiply, creating endless copies of people and vehicles and entire landscapes. Angela continued driving professionally, but she never took loads that required her to travel Highway 50 at night. She'd make excuses, claim scheduling conflicts or maintenance issues, anything to avoid driving that particular stretch of Nevada highway after dark. During daytime runs, she was fine, could navigate Highway 50 without incident, but at night, especially around 1 a.m., Angela refused to be on that road, terrified that the multiplication might begin again, might trap her in an endless fleet of her own duplicates driving through fragmenting reality. Years have passed since that August night. Angela still drives, still hauls refrigerated goods across the western states, but she carries with her the memory of passing herself 93 times in 20 minutes, of being surrounded by infinite versions of her own truck, of making eye contact with duplicate after duplicate and seeing her own confusion and terror reflected back endlessly. She knows that somewhere on Highway 50, reality is thin, fragile enough to split and multiply. And she knows that someday, another driver will experience what she experienced, will find themselves duplicated endlessly on America's loneliest road, trapped in a fleet of mirrors that shouldn't exist. Story 8. The Ore-Sitchin Truck. Michael Foster had been hauling freight for 22 years and had driven dozens of different trucks during his career. From aging Internationals held together with duct tape and determination to brand new Peterbilts with every modern convenience. When his regular truck broke down with terminal engine failure in July of 2023, Michael attended an equipment auction in Memphis, Tennessee, looking for a reliable replacement at a good price. He found a 1998 Kenworth W900 in remarkably good condition, bought it for less than half its market value, and soon discovered why the previous owners had been so eager to be rid of it. The auction listing described the truck as estate sale, minimal miles, excellent condition. The Kenworth had less than 300,000 miles on the odometer, incredibly low for a 25-year-old commercial truck. The paint was faded but intact, the interior clean and well maintained, the engine running smoothly during the test drive. Michael couldn't believe his luck when his bid of $28,000 won the truck. He'd expected to pay at least $40,000 for comparable equipment. The auction house provided minimal documentation. The previous owner had been a private individual named Thomas Garrett, deceased with no surviving family. The estate was being liquidated by the state, and the truck was part of that process. No maintenance records were available, no logbooks, no history of what loads the Kenworth had hauled during its 25 years of existence. Michael drove the truck home to Arkansas, pleased with its smooth handling and powerful engine. He spent a week going through the vehicle thoroughly, checking every system, changing fluids, replacing filters, preparing it for commercial use. The Kenworth passed inspection without issues. Michael registered it, obtained the necessary permits, and put it into service, hauling the same freight he'd always transported. The problems began on his third run with the new truck, a delivery of furniture from Little Rock to Nashville. Michael was driving through the Ozark Mountains of northern Arkansas when the CB radio came alive with a voice he didn't recognize. "Northbound Kenworth, this is Thomas. You're doing good. Keep the speed down on this grade. Don't ride the brakes." Michael keyed his mic. "This is the Kenworth. Sorry, I don't know any Thomas. You got the wrong truck." "No mistake, Michael. I'm talking to you. I know that truck you're driving. Used to be mine." A chill ran down Michael's spine. "How do you know my name?" "I know a lot of things. Been with that truck for 25 years. Still am, in a way." Michael's hands tightened on the steering wheel. The previous owner was dead, according to the auction documentation. This had to be someone playing a prank, somehow knowing Michael had purchased a truck at auction. "Look, I don't know what this is about, but I'm busy. Find someone else to mess with." "You'll see," the voice said. You'll understand soon enough. That truck has history, Michael. It remembers things. And so do I." The CB went silent. Michael tried to convince himself it was just a coincidence, just some random trucker who happened to know his name and his truck. But the incident left him unsettled. That night, parked at a truck stop in Tennessee, Michael experienced his first real indication that something was wrong with the Kenworth. He was sleeping in the cab when the engine started by itself. Michael jerked awake to the sound of the diesel rumbling to life, the entire truck vibrating with a familiar idle. But he hadn't turned the key. The ignition switch was in the off position. Michael scrambled up from the sleeper berth and turned the key to the on position, then immediately back to off, killing the engine. Silence returned to the cab. Michael sat in the driver's seat, heart pounding, trying to understand what had just happened. Engines didn't start themselves. There was no mechanism by which a diesel engine could activate without the key being turned and the starter motor engaging. He checked the ignition system thoroughly, looking for shorts or wiring problems that might explain the spontaneous start. Everything appeared normal. The key switch functioned properly. The starter solenoid showed no signs of malfunction. Michael found no technical explanation for what had occurred. The next morning, Michael completed his delivery and began the return trip to Little Rock. As he drove, he became aware of a presence in the cab. It wasn't visible or audible, just a feeling of being watched, of sharing the space with something unseen. The sensation was strongest in his peripheral vision. If he looked to the right, toward the passenger's seat, he'd catch glimpses of something, a shadow or figure that vanished when he turned his head to look directly. The CB radio crackled. "You feel me there, don't you, Michael? I told you I was still with the truck. Who are you? What do you want?" "I'm Thomas Garrett. I died in this truck 2 years ago. Heart attack. Right there in the driver's seat where you're sitting. They found me 3 days later at a rest area in Missouri, but I never really left. My body left, got buried in some cemetery, but I stayed with the truck. Couldn't let go. Ghosts aren't real. This is some kind of trick. Believe what you want. But I'm here, and I'm not leaving. This truck is mine, even if you paid money for it. I hauled loads in this Kenworth for 23 years. It's more home to me than any house I ever owned. Death didn't change that." Michael tried to ignore the voice, tried to focus on driving, but Thomas kept talking, providing a constant commentary through the CB radio. He gave advice on routes, warned about upcoming traffic, pointed out truck stops with good food or clean showers. The information was accurate and helpful, but it came from a source that shouldn't exist, from a dead man somehow still present in his truck. Objects in the cab began moving on their own. Michael would place his coffee cup in the holder, and it would shift position when he wasn't looking. His logbook would open to different pages. The radio would change stations without anyone touching the controls. Small movements, subtle changes, but consistent enough that Michael couldn't dismiss them as imagination. The presence became more tangible over the following weeks. Michael started seeing Thomas more clearly in his peripheral vision. Could make out the shape of a man sitting in the passenger seat, wearing what looked like a flannel shirt and a ball cap. If Michael tried to look directly, the figure would vanish, but it was always there at the edge of his vision, a constant companion occupying the space beside him. Thomas's voice became a regular presence on the CB. He'd talk about his years of driving, tell stories about runs he'd made and people he'd met. He'd complain about changes in the trucking industry, how regulations had become more burdensome, how the romance of the road had been replaced by corporate logistics. He spoke like a man who'd loved his job and missed it terribly, even in death. Michael found himself talking back, engaging in conversations with the ghost. It was easier than he'd expected, treating Thomas like a normal passenger rather than a supernatural phenomenon. They discuss routes and delivery schedules, debate the best truck stops in different regions, share experiences from their years on the road. Thomas was knowledgeable and friendly, his presence becoming almost comforting rather than frightening. But Thomas had a dark side that emerged periodically. Sometimes he'd become angry, possessive of the truck he considered his own. He'd criticize Michael's driving, insist that Michael was doing things wrong, handling the Kenworth improperly. During these episodes, the truck would malfunction in small ways. The transmission would slip between gears. The air brakes would hiss and release without input. The steering would tighten, becoming difficult to control. "This is my truck," Thomas would say during these angry moments. "You're just borrowing it, don't forget that." Michael learned to placate the ghost, to acknowledge Thomas's ownership and expertise. When Michael deferred to Thomas, treated him with respect, and listened to his advice, the truck ran perfectly. But if Michael asserted too much independence or made decisions Thomas disagreed with, the mechanical problems would begin. The situation reached a crisis point 3 months after Michael purchased the Kenwood. He was hauling a time-sensitive load of medical supplies from Little Rock to Dallas, running close to his delivery deadline. Michael took a route Thomas had advised against, choosing a more direct highway that Thomas claimed was always congested. "Turn around," Thomas's voice crackled through the CB, angry and insistent. "You're going the wrong way. I told you to take the northern route. I'm behind schedule. This way is faster. It's not your decision to make. This is my truck. Turn around now. Thomas, I appreciate your input, but I'm the one with the load to deliver. I'm taking this route." The truck's engine began to sputter. Power dropped dramatically, the Kenwood struggling to maintain even 40 miles per hour. Warning lights illuminated across the dashboard. The transmission wouldn't shift properly, staying locked in a low gear. Michael was forced to pull onto the shoulder as the truck became barely drivable. "Change your route," Thomas said, his voice cold, "or sit here on the shoulder forever. Your choice, Michael." Michael sat in the disabled truck, furious and frightened in equal measure. He was being held hostage by a ghost, his livelihood controlled by a dead man who refused to release his claim on the truck. "Fine," Michael said finally. "Fine, you win. I'll take your route." Immediately, the truck returned to normal operation. The engine smoothed out, power returned, the transmission shifted properly. Thomas had proven his point. He controlled the truck and not Michael, and he could disable it whenever Michael defied him. The relationship between Michael and Thomas deteriorated from that point. What had been almost friendly became adversarial, a constant power struggle over who truly controlled the Kenworth. Thomas would sabotage the truck to punish Michael for minor infractions, for taking routes Thomas disliked or stopping at truck stops Thomas didn't prefer. Michael lived in constant anxiety, never knowing when his truck would suddenly malfunction because he'd angered his ghostly passenger. Michael considered selling the Kenworth, getting rid of the cursed vehicle and buying something without supernatural attachments. But he'd invested his savings in the truck, couldn't afford to take a loss so soon after purchase. And Thomas made it clear that any attempt to sell would be met with aggressive sabotage. The truck would break down during test drives, would develop inexplicable problems that would scare away potential buyers. "You're stuck with me," Thomas said, "just like I'm stuck with this truck. We're in this together now, Michael. Might as well make the best of it." Michael learned to live with the situation, developed strategies for managing Thomas's moods and expectations. He'd consult the ghost before making decisions, ask for Thomas's input on routes and schedules. He'd talk to Thomas during long drives, treating him like a co-driver rather than an adversary. When Michael showed proper deference, Thomas would be helpful and cooperative. The truck ran perfectly, and Thomas's decades of experience proved valuable. But Michael never forgot that he was sharing his truck with something that shouldn't exist, with a dead man who refused to move on. He lived with the knowledge that at any moment, if he angered Thomas or made the wrong decision, his truck could become inoperable, his livelihood destroyed by supernatural sabotage. Other truckers began noticing Michael's habit of talking to himself in the cab. They'd see him having conversations with empty air, arguing with an invisible passenger. Some thought Michael was losing his mind, cracking under the pressure of the job. Others suspected he was using drugs, that the conversations were chemically induced hallucinations. Michael couldn't explain the truth, couldn't tell them about Thomas without confirming their suspicions of insanity. Years have passed now. Michael still drives the Kenworth, still hauls freight across America's highways. Thomas remains his constant companion, the ghost that never left his truck, that refuses to move on to whatever comes after death. They've reached an uneasy accommodation, a working relationship between the living driver and the dead one, sharing control of a vehicle that belongs to both and neither of them. Michael has stopped looking for escape. He's accepted that the Kenworth comes with Thomas, that buying the truck at that Memphis auction meant accepting a supernatural passenger for as long as he owns the vehicle. Sometimes, late at night on empty highways, Michael almost appreciates Thomas's presence. The ghost keeps him company during lonely drives, tells stories from decades of experience, provides advice that only a veteran trucker would know. It's companionship, even if it comes from an impossible source. But Michael also knows the truth. He's trapped in a partnership he never agreed to, sharing his truck with a presence that controls his livelihood through supernatural manipulation. Thomas Garrett died 2 years before Michael bought the Kenworth, but death didn't end his career as a truck driver. It simply changed the nature of his relationship with the road. And now Michael drives for both of them, the living man and the dead one, sharing the cab of a Kenwood that will never be truly his, as long as Thomas's ghost refuses to let go. Story 9. The Wrong Direction. Lisa Chen had been a professional truck driver for 15 years, specializing in cross-country runs that took her from coast to coast and everywhere in between. She'd driven every major interstate highway in America, knew the country's road network like most people know their own neighborhood. On December 9, 2022, while driving westbound on Interstate 80 in Wyoming, Lisa discovered that knowing the roads wasn't enough when the roads themselves stopped, following the rules of geography and direction. The run was routine. Lisa was hauling consumer electronics from Chicago to Sacramento, a straight shot west on Interstate 80 through Iowa, Nebraska, Wyoming, Utah, and Nevada before dropping down into California. She'd made the same trip dozens of times, could practically drive it blind. Her Volvo VNL was loaded with televisions and computer equipment, carefully secured for the 3-day journey. Lisa entered Wyoming around noon on December 8th, passing through Cheyenne and continuing west across the state's high plains. The weather was cold but clear, temperature in the teens, no snow in the forecast. Traffic was moderate, a mix of commercial trucks and passenger vehicles traveling both directions on the interstate. Around 7 p.m., somewhere between Rawlins and Rock Springs, Lisa noticed something odd about the traffic patterns. She was traveling westbound, but the vehicles she was passing seemed to be moving in slightly wrong directions. It was subtle at first, just a feeling that the angles were off, that the cars and trucks around her weren't quite parallel to the highway. Lisa checked her mirrors carefully. The vehicle behind her, a red sedan, appeared to be angled slightly to the right, as if it were planning to exit the highway, except there was no exit coming up. A truck ahead of her seemed to be drifting leftward despite staying in its lane. The vehicles were all within their lane markers, but their trajectories felt wrong somehow. She checked her GPS. The device showed her on Interstate 80, heading west as expected, making good time toward Rock Springs. The compass on her dashboard confirmed her westbound direction. Everything indicated she was traveling correctly, but the feeling of wrongness persisted. An hour later, around 8 p.m., Lisa passed a highway sign that stopped her heart. Rock Springs, 80 miles. She'd been driving west for an hour since the last time she'd seen a distance marker for Rock Springs. That sign had indicated 60 miles. Now, after an hour of westbound travel at 70 miles per hour, Rock Springs was somehow 20 miles farther away than before. Lisa immediately checked her odometer. She'd definitely driven 72 miles in the past hour. The fuel gauge confirmed appropriate consumption, but according to the signs, she'd moved away from her destination rather than toward it, as if traveling west was actually taking her east. She grabbed her CB radio. Westbound Lisa on 80 near mile marker 225. Anybody else noticing weird distance markers? A moment later, the response came through. Westbound driver here. About 30 miles ahead of you. What do you mean, weird markers? The distances to Rock Springs are increasing as I drive west. Last sign said 60 miles. Now it says 80. Doesn't make sense. A pause. That's strange. My signs have been normal. Distances decreasing like they should. Maybe you saw wrong, or maybe it's a mistake on one of the signs. Lisa drove on, watching carefully now. 10 minutes later, another sign appeared. Rock Springs, 95 miles. She was actively moving away from her destination while driving directly toward it. The geography had become inverted somehow. West and east reversed in a way that defied comprehension. She tried turning around, thought maybe if directions were reversed, she needed to travel east to actually move west. Lisa found an exit and navigated the interchange, pointing her truck back the way she'd come. Now she was traveling eastbound on Interstate 80 heading back toward Rawlins. 5 minutes later, a sign appeared, Rawlins, 120 miles. But Lisa had only been 40 miles past Rawlins when she'd started noticing the problem. Even with her attempted turnaround, Rawlins should have been less than 50 miles behind her. Now the sign claimed it was more than 100 miles in the direction she was traveling. Lisa pulled onto the shoulder, killed her engine, and sat in stunned silence. Both directions were wrong. Traveling west took her east. Traveling east took her somewhere else entirely. The interstate highway system, America's reliable network of straight roads connecting distant cities, had become impossible to navigate. She tried her GPS again. The device showed her position accurately, displayed Interstate 80 correctly, marked cities in their proper locations. But the GPS's calculated route to Sacramento kept changing, the estimated arrival time fluctuating wildly. One moment it showed 6 hours to her next scheduled stop in Salt Lake City. The next moment it showed 18 hours. Then -3 hours, which was obviously impossible. A truck pulled up behind Lisa, parking on the shoulder about 100 feet back. Lisa watched in her mirror as the driver climbed down and walked toward her rig. It was a woman about Lisa's age, wearing a heavy winter jacket and looking concerned. "You having problems?" the woman called out as she approached. Lisa rolled down her window. "Directional problems. The road isn't going where it should." "Tell me about it." "I've been trying to reach Laramie for 6 hours. Every time I drive toward it, it gets farther away. Same thing in reverse. I'm stuck on this stretch of highway. Can't reach any destination in either direction." "How long have you been stuck?" "Today is my 3rd day. I keep driving, thinking I'll break through whatever this is, but the distances just increase. I've driven over 1,000 miles in the last 3 days and haven't moved more than 100 miles from where I started." Lisa felt ice water flood her veins. 3 days. This woman had been trapped for 3 days, driving endlessly while making no actual progress. "What about side roads? Can you exit the interstate?" "I've tried. The exits lead to loops that bring you right back to the same spot on the highway. Or they lead to roads that just end after a few miles. Dead end in empty desert. There's no escape route. This isn't possible. Roads don't work this way." "I know, but here we are." "I'm Sarah, by the way. Figured if we're both stuck, might as well know each other's names." Lisa and Sarah spent the next hour comparing experiences, trying to find patterns or explanations. Sarah had entered the affected zone 3 days earlier, noticed the same gradual wrongness of traffic patterns that Lisa had observed. She'd tried everything Lisa was now considering, turning around, taking exits, stopping and waiting, calling for help. Nothing worked. The highway had become a trap that prevented actual travel despite allowing endless movement. More trucks and cars accumulated on the shoulder as the evening progressed. Other drivers were experiencing the same directional impossibilities, finding themselves unable to reach destinations in either direction. A small community formed, stranded travelers sharing information and theories about what was happening. One theory suggested magnetic interference, some anomaly affecting compasses and GPS systems. But that didn't explain the physical road signs showing impossible distances. Another theory proposed a localized distortion of space-time, a bubble where normal geometry didn't apply. That sounded more plausible, but offered no solution for escape. Lisa tried driving again around midnight, determined to push through the affected zone by sheer persistence. She traveled westbound at maximum speed, watching her odometer carefully. After 50 miles of driving, she passed the same mile marker she'd started from. She'd driven a complete loop, returning to her starting point, despite maintaining a straight course on a straight highway. The other stranded drivers reported similar experiences. The affected zone seemed to be approximately 200 miles long, stretching from somewhere east of Rawlins to somewhere west of Rock Springs. Within that zone, normal rules of distance and direction didn't apply. Drivers could move endlessly, but never actually travel anywhere, trapped in a geographic impossibility. Days blurred together. Lisa lost track of how long she'd been trapped in the zone. Her phone's calendar became unreliable, sometimes showing December 9th, sometimes December 8th, occasionally displaying dates that hadn't occurred yet or had passed months ago. Time itself seemed to be breaking down along with spatial geometry. Fuel became a concern. Lisa had been driving almost continuously, burning diesel at a steady rate, but her fuel gauge behavior was as impossible as everything else. Sometimes it would drop normally, reflecting her consumption. Other times it would refill spontaneously, as if she'd never burned the fuel. The truck operated on gasoline that both existed and didn't exist simultaneously. The stranded community developed routines. Drivers would meet at a specific mile marker each evening, though the concept of time was becoming meaningless, to share food and discuss possible escape strategies. Some drivers had been trapped for weeks, according to their accounts, though Lisa couldn't verify the timeline. Others claimed they'd only been stuck for hours, but their trucks showed evidence of weeks of continuous operation. Lisa tried to maintain her sanity by keeping detailed blogs, writing down everything she observed, but when she'd read back through her notes, they'd sometimes change. Words rearranging themselves into different sentences, dates shifting to different values. Reality was fluid within the affected zone, refusing to be pinned down or documented reliably. A truck driver named Marcus claimed to have found the edge of the zone. He described driving in specific patterns, making particular turns at particular mile markers, following a route that somehow bypassed the directional impossibilities. Several drivers tried to follow his instructions, but none could replicate his success. The zone's boundaries, if they existed, shifted and changed. Or perhaps Marcus had simply been lucky, finding a momentary opening that immediately closed behind him. Lisa considered abandoning her truck and trying to walk out of the affected zone, but the few drivers who'd attempted that reported even stranger experiences. Distance on foot behaved even more erratically than distance driven. A person could walk for hours and find themselves back where they started after covering only a few dozen yards, where they'd walk a few minutes and suddenly be miles away in some random direction. Leaving the vehicles was more dangerous than staying with them. The landscape outside began to change. Wyoming's high plains, normally covered in brown grass and sagebrush, flickered between different environments. Sometimes Lisa would see mountains that shouldn't exist in that location. Other times the terrain would be completely flat in directions that should have shown rolling hills. The physical geography was as unstable as the directional rules. Then, without warning or explanation, Lisa found herself approaching Sacramento. One moment she was on Interstate 80 in Wyoming, trapped in the impossible zone with dozens of other stranded drivers. The next moment her GPS updated, showing her on Interstate 80 in California, 20 miles from her delivery destination. The transition was instantaneous, no gradual change or sense of movement. She simply jumped from Wyoming to California as if the intervening 1,000 miles of distance had been deleted from reality. Lisa pulled into her delivery location in a state of shock. She'd lost 6 days according to the calendar. Her truck showed evidence of continuous operation during that time, hundreds of miles added to the odometer, significant fuel consumption, but she had no coherent memory of driving from Wyoming to California. There was only the trapped zone, the endless circling, and then suddenly arrival. The delivery company noted her late arrival but accepted her explanation of mechanical problems. Lisa couldn't tell them the truth, couldn't describe being trapped in a zone where directions reversed and distance became meaningless. She completed the delivery, accepted her payment, and immediately drove to a truck stop to rest. Sleep was impossible. Lisa lay in her sleeper berth, staring at the ceiling, trying to process what had happened. She'd lost 6 days to some geographic impossibility that shouldn't exist. And worse, she didn't know if she'd actually escaped. Maybe she was still trapped in the zone, experiencing an elaborate hallucination of delivery and escape. Maybe Sacramento wasn't real, was just another manifestation of the fluid reality she'd been experiencing. Lisa eventually returned to trucking, though she never took loads that required Interstate 80 through Wyoming. She'd request alternate routes, claim personal preferences for different highways, anything to avoid that stretch of road where directions had stopped following the rules. Other drivers reported experiencing similar problems in that area. Stories of impossible distances and reversed directions spreading through the trucking community like modern folklore. But Lisa knew it wasn't folklore. It was real. Somewhere in Wyoming, on a stretch of Interstate 80 between Rawlins and Rock Springs, there existed a zone where geography broke down, where west could be east and distance could be infinite, or zero or both simultaneously. Drivers entered that zone and became trapped, driving endlessly while making no progress, caught in spatial impossibilities that defied explanation. Some escaped, like Lisa, though she'd never understand how or why. Others might still be there, trapped in their endless circuits, passing the same mile markers repeatedly while reality shifts and changes around them, hoping that someday the roads will remember how to actually lead somewhere again.